So I would like to take a slightly different approach and just to shake up the tree. And let me look if I can share now my presentation. So yeah, like I said, so we looked at it more from a production, a farmer's perspective, but I would like to flip the coin a little bit to also look at it from a consumption perspective, because in the end, food systems exist because we consume. So we have food production systems, food distribution systems, for the sake of, in the end, of consumption. And so likewise, a little bit with Jessica's perspectives on that, we also need to have a global outlook. And I think the sustainability challenges are definitely on a global challenge. Think about climate change, think about geopolitical conflict and instabilities, severe weather events. But to be able to make transformations, I think we really and utterly need real deep localized understandings. And by bringing that back to also from a consumer plate, I mostly look at urban areas as consumption hotspots, and why and how and when people consume, take it as a point of departure to understand how this is wider relating to food systems of provision. So this is not to say that this is a better lens, it's just a different and complementary lens, which I think we both need. So, and likewise, that Jessica focused a bit on food sovereignty, which is generally mostly coming from also a farming perspectives. From a consumption perspective, and I would relate a little bit to the FAO definition of food security, which states that food security exists when all people at all times, and I would add under all conditions, have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food for their dietary needs, and also according to their preferences. So actually, this means that we also need to shift the global frameworks vis-a-vis localized realities, because what is then a preference? What is then a dietary needs? And also we need to think about how then formal arrangements of governance food systems interact with also informal food relations. And it is not only limited to the global south, it is also in the global north. Informality is actually a very important aspect of food systems. And it also relates then to culturally appropriateness. And then we need to put that more central if we really need to think also about the preferences of people. So then if we look at food systems, and also Jessica's pointed this out before with the same framework, that there is a conceptual tension. So first and for all, it's almost never really defined. So what is actually a food system? And therewith, it also suggests a kind of holistic perspective, but we need to think about, okay, what is then counts as the system? What is within and what is outside the system? And then also relating to Jessica's and Sylvia's presentation, then what types and whose knowledge is valued. So this is also when the political aspects comes in. And also then if we work with food systems, maybe also as an approach, then how much complexity is then reduced? So how much complexity do we allow in? Or do we actually try to simplify it also for policy measurements? So, and then the risk is, and this is a very prominent risk currently, is that there is an over-reliance on indicators, models, and dashboards. So almost every research program develops its own model, its dashboards, and normally I would say crap in is crap out. So also what types of evidence is then also really supporting this dashboard metrics? So this is something that we need to carefully reconsider. Because a recent study really pointed out that most of the dominant approaches in food system science are about outcome orientation, which also reflects this kind of dashboard Walhalla, I would say. So 74% of all studies in a large international scientific review study were all about outcomes. So what you measure. 70% were only about these drivers, such as, for instance, policy drivers, governance drivers that we also have been talking about. But only 90% is really about the action on the ground, which is actually strange when you think about food system transformation, that it should take hold on the ground where people live. And also when you look at metrics, a lot of policymakers will say the moment metrics enter my desk, they are already outdated. And actually, like also Jessica pointed out, we need strong narratives and narratives evidence. But then, okay, if there is so little evidence related to, for instance, food environment, food consumption, which is clearly pointed out here, then how do we get to this evidence? How do we create this evidence? And that it is so important is also relating to important studies related to climate change, for instance, where you see that if we want to remain within 2 centigrade climate change, that actually plant-rich diets are the most, they are the most important ones. But then if we look at the action on the other side, we see that most of the action is in the production, rightfully so, but actually unrightfully so. There's almost no action really on the diet and nutrition, and I would take that broader to food consumption. So I have 4 messages actually for today's meeting. And first is, let's take consumption as an analytical lens. What would it bring us? So first and for all, food systems are about our everyday food lives. It's our everyday fare. And it is about meals, routines, and cultural trade-offs. So not about victimizing consumers as they are subject to food environment, nor responsibilizing consumers by making rational choices. It's really about how is food embedded culturally, contextually, religiously in our everyday lives. And a good example why this is so important is from Vietnam, where policymakers were really driving and steering consumption into certain directions because of food safety. In Vietnam, there was a lot of food safety concern. And so the policymakers decided that let's do away with unhygienic wet markets and let's promote supermarkets that also provide certified safe foods. So the idea was, if consumers are concerned about food safety and if safe foods are made available in the supermarket, then consumers will purchase there. Now, this is not at all what happened. So there was a reduction of traditional markets, but in the end, they stopped the reduction of these markets because all consumers remained purchasing in street markets, and if street markets were not allowed, they just created it within their own premises. So then the policy challenges is that you actually might jeopardize and deprive people from nutritious foods by closing down markets, or stimulate less healthy diets by driving people into supermarkets. And there, but also you saw a policy dilemma or conflicting duality between nutrition and food safety. And actually a lot of consumers said, but we understand this policy challenge. We do actually respect our policymakers that they aim and want to steer it in better conditions, but they do not listen to us because we know how to also contribute to this. So this then is also about sharing responsibility with citizens and try to co-articulate the problem. So what is it that fits within their daily life, and how can they also share the responsibility? So how can we then also have better solutions? So this is one way of why including consumption would be important. But next, this also relates to creating a much broader knowledge base. So it's again also relating to this more political notion, or who gets to define the system and its problems. And therein, of course, as a lived experiences can really guide to root cause analysis. This can be so on the farmer level, but can also be so on the consumption level. So in this case is an example where we really also advocated for youth agency. So 90% of the global adolescents live in low and middle income countries. So they are the drivers of the futures of our food systems. And by listening to these youth, we only see that they really have active agency. So normally they are either victimized or responsibilized, and often they are actually victimized through food environment. But actually by doing in-depth research with these youth, and I won't go in depth, but just illustrating it, that there is not such a thing as just food consumption. We see actually that food consumption can really be nourishment focused, which a lot of projects actually really direct towards this nourishment. But also it's a lot socially driven consumption. It's being with your peers, it's having a private life in public space, it's about group solidarity. And then we see actually how these youth are also driving changes within food vendors. So youth are not only subject to food environments, they also co-create these food environments by learning vendors how to work with digital payments, providing seating area, but also demanding novel products. And that brings me to my third message, and that's about uncovering hidden dynamics. When we talk about food systems, it's important to realize that you can't govern what you don't know. And a lot of the policies currently are really about that we assume that we know what needs to be governed. And another important aspect is that is actually that informality is not just something that we want to do away with, or that is a vulnerability, or that's a temporal state that needs to transform to formality, but it's also a functioning system that is often overlooked. And an important aspect is also from this is an example from Ethiopia, again about youth agency, to keep it to the same kind of context. But then we see, for instance, in Ethiopia and Addis Ababa, very prominently how this urbanization dynamics that demolishes urban areas at a very fast pace, which drives people, displaces people from their known areas, building up completely new livelihoods in other areas, actually creates a highly dynamic environment. So for policymakers to steer into this environment would be almost impossible, because by the time they would implement their designed policies, the reality has already changed. So then we see also how these actually become sites of social innovation, resilience, and negotiation. And therewith, food environments are not only a backdrop of consumption, they actually are co-performed, they are constructed, co-constructed, and performed by vendors and youth in this case, creatively. So also here we saw how vendors are not just selling products, but they are also caring for this use, enabling gifting by smaller portion sizes, and flexible pricing, but also credits, allowing kids to buy on credit because there is a trust relation, there's a community feel, but also for kids to trust hygiene when they know the vendor and how they cook. So it's much more about this community feel than it's an economic transaction. And that actually relates to a fourth point, why this is also so important. And this has also been pointed out previously by Jessica, also to looking at the huge challenges that we are facing nowadays. So it is becoming increasingly tumultuous and uncertain in the future, if not only for climate change that is compounded now with conflict. We see that within countries, like for instance, within Ethiopia, we see a lot of conflict and how that drives previously poor man's food into becoming normal man's food again, but also, of course, on a global scale, how large conflicts and war also affect trade systems. So this also means that we need to think about flexible governance arrangement and distributed decision making. Because in the end, it's about, when we look at, for instance, from a food security perspective, at all times for all people, according to their preferences and their needs, then it is that within households, for instance, people will really do all the effort to maintain food security, and therewith also they drive change into wider food system transformation that relate to the national, but also to the regional and the global level. So what does it really mean? Actually, this means that we need to rethink food system transformation. And also this relates a little bit to the poll that Herman just shared at the beginning, that actually most of you say that consumers have quite some power in the food system, but actually that at this moment, not so much power actually of these consumers is used. So, and also then by using this power also means that learning and creating evidence from their everyday life realities. It's not only giving them all a say, because there are billions of people across the globe, but it's also looking at how do they perform their everyday activities, and how does this evidence actually surface in policy and governance relations. So therewith, citizens are not passive consumers. They are citizens. They have citizenships, and also their activities of food consumption bundle with their wider livelihoods. And therewith also, we need to understand that learning must be context sensitive. We do not want that unintended consequences, negative consequences, serve us from policy interventions, but we also want to make sure that if there are interventions, that they fit and benefit people on the local context. And therewith, we just really need to learn from people wherever they are, wherever they live, and what type of conditions, to how they also try to maintain their food security, and that will also impact wider food systems, sustainability, and justice across the globe. So this is actually where I would like to leave it for today as the last contribution, because I think that we can agree today that in the end, it's all about people.
Thank you so much, Sigrid, for those closing words, but also for another very in-depth and inspiring presentation. I'm very happy how you've helped us sort of also pay attention to the consumer side of the food system and everything in between, but particularly paying attention to the potential power and agency that consumers should and could have, but also the value of thinking in detail about a food environment, not as an inert, static something, but something that is deliberately shaped and formed to enhance specific choices or others not. So very happy to see this combination. Thanks again, all three of you, for your wonderful in-depth presentations. I forgot to tell people at the beginning of the session to buckle up because I think we've really touched on many important and valuable things.